think that most people underestimate the power of inheritance and what we're getting from our DNA.
I absolutely agree. I think, DNA is controlling so much more than we give it credit for, or that we've been able to prove scientifically.
Welcome to the Fronczak Files. I'm your co-host, Tracy Hastings.
And I'm Paul Fronczak. So Tracy, last week we were lucky enough to have George Knapp join us, one of the top investigative reporters in the world.
That was a great interview.
It really was. It was great to have him on. And he's the guy I went to in order to start this journey. And because of working with him, I was able to do the 2020s with Barbara Walters, cast a wide net, and hopefully get tips on finding out where the real Paul could be, and maybe find out who I am. In the course of doing that, I did a radio show called Coast to Coast AM, which George was gracious enough to have me on. He also did a news interview with me in 2013, April 25th, the day before Paul's birthday. One of the people listening was CeCe Moore, who, as the genetic world knows, she's one of the top genealogists, researchers in our country. She's on Finding Your Roots, many TV shows. She's a celebrity in this realm.
She absolutely is. If you've watched any true crime, listened to any true crime podcast, you're going to find your way back to CeCe Moore somewhere in that case.
You drop her name anywhere, it's going to open doors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay.
And then she reaches out to you after you cast your net so wide.
She reached out to me. As a matter of fact, let's go into the classified discovery file for this episode.
Let's do it.
She sent me a message so George set up a Facebook page, Who is Paul Fronczak, which is still going on. We have
still an active Facebook page. Go check it out.
About 23,000 people on there now.
Small group.
Yeah. We all know each other.
Right.
So April 28th, 2013, CeCe sent this. Hi, I'm a professional genetic genealogist who works closely with adoptees and others who do not have knowledge of their heritage. I am willing to donate my time to provide assistance in interpreting a DNA genealogy test. I am currently working on the Benjamin Kyle amnesiac case and many adoption searches. Please contact me here to discuss your options. Best of luck, CeCe. So anyone that would have gotten this would have jumped at it. Not me. I put it on hold for a couple of weeks. I'm not going to lie, I was inundated. Between doing the TV shows and the news, I was just inundated. But I went back a few days later and I answered CeCe, and we've been friends ever since. So CeCe had this team of amazing genetic genealogists, all working pro bono. They were all soccer moms, got together, hanging out, solving these cases. It was CeCe Moore, Carol Rolnick, Michelle Trossler, and Allison Dembski. We're lucky enough today to have CeCe Moore and Carol Rolnick.
I am thrilled to be here. Anybody that is into true crime, any of those type of shows, we know who CeCe Moore is. And seen you on several episodes of many different shows, podcasts, interviews, or just work that you've done. And so, everybody in this community is going to be aware of who you are. So I'm thrilled to meet you. I'm so glad you could join us.
Nice to meet you. Although I would say Carol would be as well known as I am if she wanted to be.
Oh.
But she needs to stay under the radar a bit. So she is equally as skilled and amazing at this work. But people don't know her name.
Why is that,
much.
Carol?
That's very nice of you to say, CeCe. I am not as good in front of a camera. I mean, CeCe's super well-spoken and I think represents our community so well and is really, really comfortable when it comes to interviews and getting the word out there. So I'm happy to kind of do the work and just kind of stay in the background. And I love solving cases more than anything in the world, but I'm happy to let someone else, talk to the cameras.
I understand that.
I think your case was our first collaboration, if I'm remembering correctly, and we've worked together ever since. When I started working with law enforcement, Carol was the very first genetic genealogist that I brought onto my team. So that was the start. Working your case was the start of a great collaboration between us.
How did you two meet? How did you two know each other from the genealogy community?
Carol, do you want to help?
I know exactly how we met. So CeCe founded a DNA interest group here in Southern California, and I attended. That was at the end of 2011. CeCe was speaking at that group, and it was an epiphany for me. I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I just was so thrilled. I'm like, I have to go talk to her. And so started attending these DNA interest group meetings through the Genealogical Society locally. And we would hang out afterwards. We'd all, there was a small group of us that would go and have drinks and dinner afterwards. And, that's how we kind of started talking. And in fact, that's how I ended up getting involved on this case too, was that CeCe had been explaining that, she was working on this crazy case. And, a couple of us said, hey, do you need some help? We'd be happy to help here.
Which was unusual for me because I almost always worked my cases alone. That's still true. But your case was just so much. It was so overwhelming. It was so difficult. So when she and Michelle offered to help, I took them up on it, which was, again, unique because it wasn't usually a team effort when I would work a case.
All right. So CeCe, speaking of that, what caught your eye about my story that made you want to be a part of it?
Well, I think, first of all, it was just that you really seemed invested in it. It was obviously and understandably incredibly important for you. And then there was two prongs to it, right? We usually only have one, where we're trying to find someone's biological family through their DNA. But then you also had the search for the real Paul Fronczak. And although I didn't think I'd be able to help on that as much, since that's more like looking for a needle in a haystack, I can't use your DNA to find him, I was still intrigued by that, the fact that this was that two-pronged search at the same time. But you just seemed really authentic and invested and, emotional about it. I understood as an outsider, as much as an outsider could, how important this was to you.
And here we are 13 years later, right? Still at it. Isn't that crazy?
It is 13 years later. Wow.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
So this month
Wow.
actually is the anniversary of when we found out who I really was, but we'll get into that later. But so the whole thing, this is what's crazy, right? It seems like we're like the OGs of the ancestry testing world, because like when I first tested, we had no matches. So when I first did Identigene to find out if I was really Paul, I sent the test in on July 4th, and I didn't get the results till October 15th. And imagine if people had to wait 3 and 4 months now to find stuff out like that. It'd be crazy, right?
Yeah, that's almost unheard of that results would take that long now.
Oh yeah, you can get a paternity type test overnight.
Yeah. But back then, it seemed like it took years. And then you and I didn't actually open the Ancestry account until May 2nd, 2013.
Yeah, because they didn't launch for a while. They were not the first company to offer autosomal DNA. And so, they were more of an afterthought in many of the early searches. We started with family tree DNA, with 23andMe, et cetera.
This really was one of the earliest successful searches. There were, a handful that were happening around that time. I actually took a little dive into the numbers of testers this morning, just because I think it's important to understand for context. In December of 2014, which was kind of in the thick of it, but just before, this was resolved, there were only 1.5 million total commercial testers between the big four databases, 1.5 million. In March of 2025, just a couple of months ago, it was noted that there are 53 million testers. So this was really, really early days. There were matches there, but they were very distant matches. And you were lucky when you got a second cousin match coming in.
Oh yeah, we used to call it being struck by lightning to
Yeah.
get a second cousin match, which is hilarious now because people go, oh, I didn't get anything good. I just got a couple first cousins
Yeah.
and a couple second cousins. And I'm going, what?
Okay, that's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Okay, so we opened the ancestry kit, and then the first match I had was Fran Kirby. She was a third or fourth cousin, I think. And so you guys started working,
Right, but
right?
Jewish. So, well, yes, but one other thing that made your search so incredibly difficult was the population groups that your matches came from. And so Fran Kirby, if I remember correctly, had Jewish ancestry. And so I knew that she was going to be more distantly related than she was being predicted to be, because my work with Jewish ancestry using autosomal DNA had already told me that the amount she shared with you was going to be very difficult to help us identify you. So I wasn't super excited about what you had. I mean, I had originally thought it would be much more straightforward than it was.
All right, so walk me through your process. How'd you guys get started into this?
Well, let's see. Going way back, I was interested in genealogy, and I was also separately interested in genetics. It was just two things I'd always had an interest in. And after 9/11, all of my jobs canceled. You know how this is the gig type work, Paul, I think. I had a bunch of modeling jobs and hosting jobs and acting jobs and things, and everything was canceled after that tragedy, of course, that happened on 9/11. And so I suddenly had no work and nothing to do. And I'd been working consistently, for years at that point. So it was the first time I really had time to breathe. And I started working on my family's genealogy at that point. I, as I said, always been interested, but it wasn't something that I had much time for until then. And once I started digging into that, I found that there was a company called Family Tree DNA that was offering DNA tests to help people learn more about their family tree. So that was amazing to me that two of these interests of mine were combining in such a unique way. So it took me a while to actually start testing because I was, a starving artist and very careful where I spent money, and it was very expensive back then. So I was just reading a lot about, finding what I could out there about genetic genealogy in the very early days, 2001, 2002. And then it was mid 2000s when I finally decided to splurge and get a test for my father.
Huh.
Yeah, well, I can then fast forward. I always felt hamstrung by the fact we only could do Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, and we had asked the scientists at Family Tree DNA, why can't we use autosomal DNA? Because then we could learn about the inner branches of the family tree, and women could learn about their father's side without testing a male. And we were told it couldn't be done, that the recombination rates were too fast and it would never happen. And then in late 2009, 23andMe introduced Relative Finder as a beta test, which was using autosomal DNA to find relatives. So at that point, I dropped everything else I was doing, dumped all my work on my partner, jumped in with both feet, and worked probably 100 hours a week, pro bono, because of course there were no such thing as professional genetic genealogists, and just did everything I could to learn about this new incredible science. And to me, the potential was really huge. And so that's when I really committed myself to
Wow,
it.
that's
More than
fantastic.
full time.
So Tracy, what do you think about all this?
I can absolutely relate. Same thing. I had an interest in genealogy and dug into my family's history. And also, I'm a registered nurse. And so I have a medical background, genetic background. So combining the two was a really brilliant thing to do. And so reading about it and hearing about it, what a brilliant idea this is. And I solved my first case for a coworker of mine who found out that she was adopted at 30 days old. And for her 65th birthday, she gave herself an ancestry test kit and tested and couldn't read the DNA. So I taught myself how to do it and identified her biological parents for her. And I was hooked.
I think we all get each other because this is, that's what attracted me to this kind of field as well. I got into genealogy, just, had an interest in it, like I think all my life, but never really had time to look into it until we moved to Southern California and I didn't have a job. And I thought, well, let me do this, 14-day free trial on Ancestry and check this out. I've always, wanted to kind of see, what things were about. And that was just, the vortex. I just got sucked in, and it was like, how much do you want me to pay? Yes, I'll pay you double that. It was, I didn't care at that point. It was so much fun. And I took some classes to really learn how to do genealogy correctly. And, we all kind of jump in with both feet, and it's, we start copying things off to other trees. And I really wanted to learn how to do it right. And right around that same time was when they were starting to introduce the autosomal testing. And I too saw, the potential in this. I thought, this is the ultimate piece of evidence, genealogical evidence here, to prove relationships where you didn't have a paper trail. And so I think, that was the similar kind of string that connected all of us, is that we knew this tool had so much power and so much potential. And, with your case, I'm not sure that you ever had that strong belief that we could solve this for you, Paul. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but we always knew that this was the only way that your case was going to get solved. And we knew it could be done.
Yeah.
It was just a matter of
Well,
time.
I'm a hardcore optimist. I mean, to me, I believe that anything is possible. When I first started this, I said, I'm going to find Paul. And everyone laughed at me and said, you're an idiot. You're never going to find this guy. It's been 50 years, right? No, you didn't.
I didn't
You
laugh
didn't. But everyone else I knew pretty much said, what the hell is this guy doing, But, I mean, so you guys came in, and I never doubted what you could do. I just had no idea what you were doing. All I know is that I was waiting a lot, and I loved, like, the midnight texts, or when something would come through and CeCe would contact me, hey, can you talk? I was like, oh, this is going to be good, right? I lived for those moments. So for you starting on this journey, what was like the first big thing that you thought, now we're onto something?
With your case?
Yes.
That's hard to think back. Well, okay, at first, it was when 2020 told me you had a second cousin that had come in. And I thought, oh, well, that's it. In fact, I told 2020's producers that, oh, this should be a slam dunk. A second cousin, we can ID him. Fantastic. So, in your story, that things never turned out as they seemed. And so really early on, I had a ton of confidence. As Carol said, even before she joined the team, I was sure we'd be able to solve your case, at least half of it, at least be able to identify your biological origins, although I also believed eventually it would be the answer to finding the real Paul. But I never could have imagined, all the twists and turns that we would find. So that was the first time that I thought, aha, yes. And then, as you know, it turned out he was adopted. And so that wasn't nearly as straightforward as we thought. And then I think there were many, many months before we had anything else happen that was really promising. And so there was just a lot of groundwork that had to be laid. There was a lot of patience and dedication that we all had to have to just keep on trying to find, that key, that time where we go, oh, this is going to lead us in the right direction.
I was just going to say, there was something kind of important that happened. I was looking back at our notes and our message strings this morning and kind of reliving some of this from 10 years ago. And I think when Ruth came in, she was a predicted second cousin on the Tennessee side. That was a big turning point as well. And that happened in February of 2015. So that was, up to that point, most of the focus had been on this New Jersey, Pennsylvania Jewish side, Jewish Italian side. And then suddenly we had something a little bit better to work with on the Tennessee side. And we hit the ground running and really started to kind of work Ruth's tree and Ruth's cousins. And we spent so much time trying to identify reference testers, calling them on the phone, telling them the story, getting them invested in this, getting them to test. And we ended up testing 4 different people on her 4 different great-grandparent lines, and spent a ton of that. To me was a really big turning point, and felt like we were going to get it across the finish line at that point. But then there was another twist to the story. Of course, none of those 4 reference testers shared any DNA with you, and we suddenly realized Ruth is more distantly related to you than a second cousin.
And it was the same issue. It was that population group issue again. So we had this highly endogamous population group on your Jewish side, but unfortunately the Tennessee side also had what I call pedigree collapse, which is basically a form of endogamy that's not as old. But in both cases, on both sides of your tree, we had matches that looked to be more closely related than they were. And so that was very frustrating to find out that not only were we dealing with that on one side, we were with the other. And I just want to quickly give a shout out to Bennett Greenspan at Family Tree DNA, because the reason we were able to do all of those target tests was because he donated the kits at Family Tree DNA to do those. So that was greatly appreciated, because we were on a budget, of course.
Yeah, that was really, really cool. And so let's go back to the results real quick. So I was raised as Paul, who was Polish Catholic. We get the results back from Ancestry, and it comes out I'm 40% Ashkenazi Jewish. So that threw a whole wrench in my whole upbringing. I was baptized as Paul. I was baptized as Scott, and actually I was born Ashkenazi Jewish. So the whole thing was just I'm going to heaven either way. I know that. Yeah.
Talk about an identity
an
crisis.
Boy, everything, right? I'm going to burn either one. But I remember when we got the results back, you were like, Ashkenazi, it's going to be tough. It's because the records are really tough to deal with that, right?
Right. Yeah. You have such a complex, what we call admixture, your ancestral origins. And that actually was really important in our search. And that was another time where I thought, oh, this is really helpful, because it was so unique. You had Jewish on both sides of your family, which would be unusual for somebody you had like 37.5% Ashkenazi Jewish, I think at that time. That's what the prediction was. So we would think that's all on one side of your tree, but it wasn't. And then we could see you had Southern European, and you had Eastern European, and then you had roots that went deep into the United States and Tennessee. And so it was this really unique admixture that I thought was going to help us, because it was so unusual. And when we are trying to find the connections between the trees, it often really helps us when we have those clues. Like we're looking for someone who married into a Jewish family and someone who married into a Southern European family, which in your case was Italian. But again, it wasn't as straightforward as we thought. So when I saw those results, I also was very encouraged initially and thought, aha, this is going to help us. This is going to point us in the right direction, because it was so unusual.
So it was tough to get things going, and then you started talking with my third cousin, Amy Gurley, right?
Yeah, Amy was a huge help. And this is actually before Carol, Michelle, and Allison were helping. So this is when it was just all me. But Amy was like an early partner, I'll say, in the genetic genealogy portion, because she was so willing to help and reach out to her other family members. So I created what we now call is a genetic network. It's match clusters who not only share DNA with you, but also share DNA with each other. And Amy was really key in helping to reach out to those people and try to figure out what the common ancestors were on that side of your family tree.
So Amy had this habit of knowing her family history verbally from her grandfather. And because of that, and the information that you were able to find, you two worked together to figure out who might be involved with a close match with me.
Right. So this was actually your Italian branch, and we knew somebody had to have a child with someone of Jewish heritage. That made sense based on your chart. It's sort of complex, but when you look at your admixture chart, those chromosome browser type charts that they used to only have at 23andMe, we could see that those two types of segments were adjacent to each other. We were seeing Jewish segments, and then right next to it, we were seeing those Italian segments. And so we knew that probably somebody in Amy's family, her extended family, had a child with someone of Jewish ancestry. And from her father, she actually had some oral history about that. So that was really helpful. And then the other thing that Amy did is she organized these conference calls with all the matches in this genetic network, or as many of them as we could find that would agree, which was a lot. And we would talk about it in these conference calls and trying to come up with the possible answer. And at that time, shockingly now, looking back, is when Lenny Rocco's name first came up. And so that was of great interest, actually pretty early on.
So how did that come up?
In the search.
How did Lenny's name pop up?
Well, we knew who, so Alan was part of this genetic network. And I don't know if you've told the story yet, but Alan ended up passing away before we could work closely with him on his adoption. But 2020, ABC was able to get the judge to open his adoption records. So we had identified his birth mother, but she refused to give any information on the birth father, and she actually denied that she was Alan's birth mother altogether. And so we couldn't get any information on his paternal side, and I had built his mother's tree, and I just didn't see any connections at all. So I really believed it was on Alan's birth father's side. And so we needed somebody who was living in the same area as Alan's birth mother at the right time, right? She was a young teenager. And so probably a boy in her high school was what we figured is who she conceived Alan with. And as we were on these conference calls with the Italian side, somebody mentioned that Lenny Rocco had lived in that neighborhood. And so I went and did research on him and found that, yes, indeed, he did appear to have gone to high school with Alan's birth mother. And so that is why he really became of interest to me early on. But again, there was a complication, which is, I always say the DNA doesn't lie, but you have to figure out what it's telling you. And I had someone tested from Lenny's direct paternal line, so his Y chromosome. We knew your Y chromosome was of Jewish origin. And so we also knew Alan's Y chromosome, which wasn't the same as yours. But we knew that if Lenny was the birth father of Alan, then he should have an Italian Y chromosome, right? His Y chromosome should trace back to Italy. But when we tested it, it traced back to Eastern Europe. And so that was a big surprise. And I actually asked Bennett Greenspan, has this type of Y chromosome profile ever been found in central Italy? And he said no. So I felt like, okay, I was wrong. Lenny cannot be the birth father of Alan because it should be a direct paternal line that has Italian origins, and it doesn't. And so that misled me and took me away from Lenny Rocco for quite a long time until we finally circled back.
What's the reason you circled back?
It was actually Ancestry. So Ancestry.com, if you remember, also was really interested.
They were almost fighting against you guys for time.
Yes, we were in a bit of a race, I guess. We have to admit.
A fight, but a race.
We had put a lot of time and energy, and as you know, all pro bono volunteer hours into it. And so we really wanted to be the ones to come up with the answer. But Ancestry had a lot more resources than we did, and they were calling your matches, and they called Amy. And Amy mentioned Lenny Rocco because we had that name come up in that conference call. And so they just sent him a test. They contacted him or a close family member of his, I don't know which, and he agreed to test. And they sent him a test, and it came back, and he was indeed Alan's birth father. So that was a time where the DNA misled me, which was, I think that was the first time that it ever happened at that point. And so it was a big shock to me that the Y DNA had led me to the wrong conclusion.
And just to clarify, so the person we were referring to earlier, who you matched to, who found out that they were adopted, that was Alan Fish. That was the person that you were hoping was going to give you the answers, and then found out he was also looking for his answers. Yeah.
So he and I actually, we started chatting through the message system on Ancestry. He was excited to meet me because he had no family, and I was really excited to meet him because I had none. And we were planning to meet in New York, and everything was going great. A few days before we were supposed to meet, he woke up not feeling well, said he had some chest pains. So he went to the hospital, and his wife said that he was telling everyone, you got to hurry up, run these tests. I'm going to New York to meet some real family. And that day he died in the hospital. And when I think about it now, it's still just, it makes me so sad because, he was looking forward to that. He spent the last few days of his life really trying to find real family, not knowing that his life was going to be over. And that just breaks my heart, Look, I got to meet his family, the nicest people ever. I mean, I should say my family. They're my cousins, but it's just, that's how this whole story's been, right? You get one step forward and then something crazy happens that you never even think is going to happen.
And he was such a big part of this story. It is so sad that he didn't get to actually participate because he was really a key part of it. And his family, as you said, continued to help us because they knew how much it meant to Alan. But it's just so incredibly sad that he didn't get to, have the positive outcome that we eventually were able to have. I mean, if he could have met Lenny, oh my gosh, how amazing would that have been?
I got to spend time with Lenny. I got to play in his band. He was actually in my movie and boxing and doing all these cool things that he did. He was larger than life, and he was only like 5'7". He was just a great guy. I'm so glad I got to some time to meet him. But soon after we hung out, he got sick and then he passed away. But it's timing is everything, right? At least you have these moments to spend with these amazing people.
Yeah, we always feel like it's a race against time because too many times we have found a close biological family member right after they passed away. And sometimes it's been so heartbreaking to find out that they were also searching for years or decades for their lost family member and we just missed them. So you just never know. That's why we don't want to delay these searches. It's why we stay up all night many times. We have a very hard time breaking away from these searches, especially when they feel like they start opening up and we know we're on the right direction because we just want to get those answers to people like you very, very quickly as we possibly can.
And as hard as this was to do this in 2015 with the small databases, it was exactly the right time to be doing this because, as it turns out, there were a few people that were still living who you were able to get answers from. And if this had happened any later than it did, I don't think that you would know nearly as much about your family. So it's good that it did happen when it did.
Yeah, timing is everything, right? So CeCe, you and your team started hitting microfiche libraries, researching books, records, right? And you started finding things that started fitting into a puzzle for you guys.
Yeah, initially, all of the work is done online, which is pretty typical. There are fortunately billions of records that have been digitized that we can find on places like Ancestry.com or Family Search, newspaper archives. So that's what we were really digging into until we got a lot closer. And when we got a lot closer, yes, that's when, like Allison, one of our team members, who's on the East Coast, actually drove to Atlantic City to search on microfiche through the newspaper archives that were not digitized and online. Maybe they are today, but they weren't then. And so, as I said, initially we were all just at our computers. Me on my laptop, just Michelle with her board with her sticky notes. If remember, we've seen those in pictures. And we just were sitting at our homes, ignoring our families, digging into your family.
Absolutely.
You know how it is. I think we all know.
Well, the other tool I think that was a really big part of this research was the telephone. Honestly, we did as much online research and, finding the genealogical records as we could. But, when I look back on this, I realized we knew after Lenny Roco was in the picture, we knew that you had to fit into this Roco family. We knew where you had to fit into the Roco family in theory. Like you had to be a second cousin of Alan Fish. So one of Lenny Roco's first cousins was a parent of yours. And we knew who all of Lenny Rocco's first cousins were. And we had those families mapped out in great detail, but we could not put together where a boy born in April of 64 could possibly fit into any of these families. It just didn't make sense. So that's when we started to make phone calls. And
That's when you started to make phone calls.
I mean, somebody had to know something, right? That was really kind of the working theory, was that, we had these families mapped out. We had, we turned away from the Roco side for a while, focused on the Tennessee side. And then when we were let down by the fact that none of these second cousins of Ruth's shared any DNA with you, and we realized she's farther back, we pivoted again, came back to the Roco family and said, he's got to fit into one of these first cousin families. Where does he fit? And we started to make some phone calls to see whether we could get anyone else to reference test in that family, because we knew that if we could get someone, to test, that would guide us. At least we could start eliminating one line or the other. And I actually was remembering back too that Lenny was the one who had remembered a story about his first cousin, David, who had given up twins and for adoption. And so we had this, string going, thinking, who were these twins that David gave up? And so we actually targeted David's family to try and do some, DNA testing there. And we were never, actually, I think we got somebody on his wife's line. We got someone on his wife's line to test. And that helped us to rule out David's side, So we were like, okay, then it's not the twins, that Lenny remembered.
Which was another big letdown, of course.
Yeah. Because we had heard this theory from Lenny. And of course, God bless Lenny. I mean, he remembered the story, but just not the right cousin who had given up the twins.
Yeah. And so, Paul, early on, I was worried that you might have been conceived from a out of wedlock. Mm-hmm. And so that was always the concern too, is we weren't looking at the spouses as closely, because we were thinking, okay, it's one of Lenny's first cousins who had a baby out of wedlock and either gave it up for adoption, or if it's one of his male first cousins, maybe he didn't even know about the child. And so nowadays we know that the majority of foundlings, or pretty close to the majority anyway, come from married couples. But back then, we assumed that if someone was a foundling like you, an abandoned baby or child, that it was more likely a single mother. That ends up not being the case. So I was really pursuing a misconception at that point. But it was so early on, we hadn't helped solve hundreds of foundling cases like we have now, and seen that we should have been looking for a married couple, that was actually more likely.
That's absolutely true. And, I was thinking back when we were mapping Gilbert's family, we knew he had 3 children, one born in 61, 63, 65. It was perfect, right? There shouldn't be another child that was born in 64 that's missing. It didn't make sense for there to be a third child born in 65 and then suddenly a child who's a full sibling that's not there. It just didn't make sense logically to us. So, we kind of discounted that, and really we're looking at different first cousins. So this, was a surprise to all of us that this truly was a married couple. And as CeCe said, we have found that pattern since then. This is very, very typical of foundlings.
Yeah, they're not usually the first child. They are usually born into a family that already has children and can't take another, or is struggling having another. So we often find full siblings for foundling cases, and unfortunately in the law enforcement cases we work now, where that foundling passed away when they were abandoned, we're also seeing the same thing. If we had known that then, we would have looked much more closely very early on at the spouses of Lenny's first cousins, and we weren't focused on that. And if we had, we would have found that connection between the Tennessee side and the Italian/Jewish side much more quickly than we did. And so that is something that would be much quicker today because we would know to look for that. And so it was, it was part of a learning experience, right? Your case was so early that there were some things that we had misconceptions about that today we know the truth.
And so, if I remember correctly, it was a phone call that one of you had with Susan's mom that gave you a piece of information that really got things rolling.
Yes, that was a phone call that I had placed. I had actually been calling around to lots of different people in the family, trying to find someone who was a willing reference tester.
Wasn't
And-
there like a whole house fire story you were told?
Oh, yes, yes.
There's lots of excuses.
There were excuses. I actually spoke at one point to what turns out to be Paul's younger brother. I talked to him about DNA testing. He was going to think about it over the weekend and then just, nope, I don't want to do this. And so I just was, kind of trying to find, I actually was trying to find Leonard. And I identified someone that I believed was his ex-wife.
So not Lenny, but Leonard. There's two.
Yeah, Gilbert's brother Leonard, who was a first cousin of Lenny Roco. And I was pretty certain that this woman was probably his ex-wife and that there was a daughter as well. I was hoping it was a biological daughter of Leonard, excuse me. And I was hoping that she would test. And so, I reached out to them. I kind of started to talk a little bit about the story. Now, we didn't usually come straight out with the whole story at the very first conversation. So I gave her a little bit of information about what we were doing, and she was like, "Oh, okay, this is interesting. Oh, let me think about it." And then I called back about a week later. I think we actually got permission from you, Paul, to share the actual story and send a link, to the news story. And so I called back and I said, I am allowed to share some more information with you. Here's a link. This is a gentleman by the name of Paul Fronczak, and here's his story. And that's when she opened up and she started, to tell me about, because I was trying to identify somebody missing in the family. And she started to talk about her ex-husband, Leonard's brother, Gilbert. And she knew Gilbert's family very well. She had visited them up in New Jersey, usually every summer. And she remembered that there was a set of twins that had been in that family. And they had apparently gone to live with someone in Marie's family, but they sort of disappeared. And she had an unusual situation too, where the twins were kind of explained away within these two families by, Marie and Gilbert would say to Marie's family that someone in Gilbert's family had taken care of the twins. And to Gilbert's family, they said someone in Marie's family had taken care of the twins. And they actually named people. And this woman was one of the people that was named as allegedly taking care of the twins. And she ran into somebody from Marie's family at one point when she was visiting New Jersey. And she asked about the twins. And she said, "Hey, how are the twins doing?" And this woman said, "Well, I thought you had the twins." And she realized, something's very strange here. And as, we've all learned, kind of was the way that things happened in the 60s, they just realized, okay, this is none of our business. We don't really want to dig any further into this. And they dropped it. But she remembered this. She shared this with me on the telephone call. My hands were shaking. I was like, I can't believe this. We have to figure out exactly when these twins were born and whether, the boy of these two twins could be Paul. And that's when we sent Allison looking for that newspaper article that was
a jackpot
to find.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't know about it, and except for she remembered seeing this newspaper article. She knew it existed, so that was what sent us on that journey.
And what was in that article? What was the aha moment?
Well, it turned out that the twins had actually been born on their older sister's birthday. And that was a really unusual situation. And so a newspaper reporter picked that up, a local reporter in Atlantic City. And there was a little blurb she remembered being in a newspaper about the fact that these twins had been born on their older sister's birthday. So that's
And
what
that was the first evidence of Jack's existence. That was, we'd heard rumors, we knew where he would fit in the tree, but that was the first like hard piece of evidence that we could say, yes, he existed.
Because in the article, the babies were named, correct?
I believe
Jack and
they-
Jill.
Jack and Jill.
Yeah, certainly the parents were named, and it started to make sense too. We realized that Lenny Roco remembered this story he'd heard about a first cousin giving up twins for adoption, and we thought this had to be the story he remembered. He just remembered the wrong cousin.
Which is so common in family oral history, right? There's like a grain of truth often, but with that telephone game, it gets twisted. And you have to try to, it's important to take those pieces of oral history and not just discard them because they're so often wrong, because there is often an element of truth to
So after you had that information and it was confirmed that there were twins by Gilbert and Marie, what was the next step to really confirm your hunches?
Well, I'll tell you, my very next step that I took was that I called your younger brother. I immediately hung up with Leonard's ex-wife, and I tried to call your younger brother because I had just spoken to him, maybe a few days before that, and he said he didn't want a DNA test. And I said, do you know that your parents had twins? And he was like, you're crazy. This is,
scam.
this is a scam. Are you kidding me? No way, So that was even before I messaged, the rest of the team. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is such a well-hidden secret. I can't believe we broke this open. And it took somebody who was married into the family, someone who had no allegiance to this family any longer to break this story open. I'm so grateful for her sharing that story. Otherwise, I'm not sure we would have ever gotten to the bottom of this.
And then that's what made us finally look at the spouse, Marie. I believe this is the right timing, Carol, right?
Yes.
So then we stayed up all night, or I stayed up all night and they stayed up most of the night. We were building her tree. And that's when we knew. There was absolutely no doubt. I had always said, we'll know it when we see it because of that unusual admixture. And we built her tree back and we went right back to Tennessee where we needed to be. And then we found that she had a Jewish great-grandparent and an Eastern European, or is it great-great? Anyway, we needed a more distant Jewish ancestor on that side, and we needed an Eastern European great-great-grandparent for you. And we ran right into that. And that's pretty unique in Tennessee at that time. And so we knew. There was no question once we had your full tree built out. We had the Jewish, we had the Italian, we had the Tennessee, we had the Jewish on the maternal side, we had the Eastern European. It just all fit perfectly, finally. But, Carol's skill at calling people and getting important information, it's just unmatched. I mean, it was, in this case, so important. And most of the time, I can work my cases without ever reaching out to anybody. But your case absolutely required that. So thank God she asked me if she could help on your case, because that's something I'm more hesitant to do. I don't like to reach out as much, and I will keep pounding at it, on my computer, trying not to reach out to people. But she's ready to pick up that phone.
Well, and that actually kind of opened up the floodgate too. We needed to talk to some more people. We knew as genetic genealogists this was solid, but we wanted to get a paternal first cousin and a maternal first cousin to test. If we couldn't get one of your siblings to test, we needed to find those cousins. And so, I ended up making some more phone calls to a first cousin on Marie's side of the family, and then Susan again, and talking to them about this situation and getting them to DNA test. And that was, the absolute confirmation. You had a first cousin on both sides in terms of how much DNA you shared with them. There was no other answer that it could be.
And that's the next best thing. When we can't get an immediate relative to test, your siblings said no, your birth parents were deceased, we had trouble finding aunts and uncles. And so that's what you really need, is you want to have as close of a relative on mom's side and as close of a relative on dad's side as you can find. And so that was our genetic proof, since we couldn't get your siblings to test.
Did you find it a little crazy that my real siblings wouldn't test?
It's not that unusual.
Really?
Yeah, unfortunately,
That's so
a
sad.
lot of people are hesitant to open up family secrets. And in your case, this was such a negative family secret. And I know they said they didn't know about you, but I feel like they knew there was something really negative, something really bad that had happened. And so they're much less likely to want to do it. Now, we certainly see the flip side too, where family members are very enthusiastic to welcome that new family member. But I think that's in cases that are a little more straightforward than yours. I think there was
Probably a lot of
this
secrets.
deep, dark secret.
Yeah.
We know there was a deep, dark secret. And certainly, what happened to Jill, is another one. And I think if they didn't know it, they at least
Okay.
felt it. And they didn't want to open that up in their family.
But both of your first cousins knew of your existence. Susan actually remembered meeting you. She was, I think, around 5 years older. So she remembers as a young child meeting these twin cousins, but was later told, don't talk about the twins. And then your cousin, I think she was in the Chicago area on your mom's side of the family who tested. She remembers growing up knowing that she had twin cousins, although she never met them. And so this was kind of an open secret in the rest of the family, but within your, full siblings, they were just, I do truly believe they were never told. This was hidden pretty well from them.
But don't you think they must have felt something? Like, weren't there fights between the parents?
Yes.
What happened to the twins? Or they knew something at least deep down, even if they weren't aware of Jack and Jill.
Well, I mean, I had two older sisters. One was 3 years older. I mean, she should have remembered something.
But that's right at the edge of when you
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
have memories, I think
Yeah.
some people remember at 3 years old and others not until they're about 4. So
With trauma, I just read an article about this, that if something traumatic happens, you do tend to remember it younger. And so most of us don't really remember much till like 4 or 5. But if something really bad happened early on, they do tend to remember that more based on what some studies have said recently. But again, it's not going to be forefront of the mind, right? It's going to be really buried down there. And so,
Like hypnotherapy buried.
yeah.
Like you'd said,
Well,
earlier, CeCe, there's a kernel of truth in there, but what's real? What is a child able to recall factually? There's something there, but are the details there? Probably not.
Yeah, but clearly there was trauma. I mean, we know from the way Jack and Jill were treated, at least what we've heard how they were treated, that things were not good in that household.
Yeah. So after you got DNA tests from both first cousins, you guys got the results. Do you remember the phone call you gave me?
Yes, very well.
Tell me how that went.
I texted you. You were at work, so I texted you and said, "Can you talk?" And as usual, you were like, "Absolutely, yes." I think you went out to your car. You took a break, went out to your car, and we were all on the phone. We all wanted to be there to tell you, of course, because the entire team had worked incredibly hard. And so we were all on there as a conference call, and I said, "What do you think about the name Jack?"
And I said, that's a good name. It's a strong name.
You did, because you had told me before you never really felt like a Paul. And so,
I still don't. Yeah.
and we know why now. And so it was hard to know how to break it to you. Like, after all these twists and turns, all of this work, all of the updates and non-updates that we'd given you, to finally have answers, it's hard to say, "Look, we're there, like, this is it." And so it was kind of a difficult call, but certainly a very exciting call to finally be able to give you what you had
Yeah,
looked
because
for
we
so long.
started this work doing this together in April of 2013. And I think you told me on June 2nd, 2015, my real name. That's a long time.
It is, and it was only because the databases were so small back then, as we've said. And also we didn't know as much as we know now. Like, as I've mentioned, we would have built out the spousal lines way earlier now than we did then. But we were looking for this out of wedlock birth, and so we weren't putting as much importance on that. Now that's something we would immediately do. And so now I think I've said we would be able to solve your case in hours or days, maybe weeks, because Carol still might have, needed to make those phone calls to get the information that she did, but it would not have taken 2+ years. Definitely not.
It was crazy. And so after you told me my name, you gave me about 3 seconds to process that. And then you said, there's more. You've got a twin sister. Her name is Jill. She's missing. And I was like, what the fuck? What?
How did you feel?
That's how you felt,
that was
right?
crazy. I had to go back to work then.
Yeah.
I wasn't very productive.
Yeah. How that even works.
I mean, as I'm sure you've talked about already, in your case, answers always bring more questions. There's just never an end. There's never a resolution. So we finally were able to tell you your real name and your biological heritage, but yet we opened up this whole other search for you. Where's Jill? And that is the one we still have not.
I think the first thing I said was, now I got to find Jill, right? It's like, let's keep going. Just keep going.
Yeah, you can't rest on your laurels at all. You can't even take a few minutes to go, oh, finally, this is solved, right? Because it immediately turns into the search for Jill.
I remember walking back into the office, and I stood there in front of everyone, and I said, I'm Jack. I remember doing that. And they're like, okay, go back to work. Yeah.
I've never heard that part.
It was, go back to
they
work.
say?
Yeah, shut up. Yeah.
You're crazy.
Yeah.
I don't have
What?
time for this.
Yeah. Sit down.
Yeah.
Call
Yeah,
me
just
Jack
Jack.
now. I'm changing my name.
I actually remember that phone call because I was at my son's school play.
Oh, jeez.
And I know, I'm not sure if I ever shared this with you, but I was kind of, keeping an eye on my text strings and everything. And CeCe was like, I think it's going to happen. So we're trying to get everybody on the line together and everything. And I thought, I think he's coming out onto the stage, and I had to get up and leave.
Oh, no.
I know. Well, he saw me leave, and of course he came up to me afterwards, and he was like, Mom, what happened? You left right before, I came onto stage. And I said, we solved the Paul Fronczak mystery. And he was like, oh my gosh, he knew how much that meant. And, I knew that my friend had video recorded the play and I could see it. And I wanted to be a part of that call.
And that's just an example of how we don't want to wait. Like, we want to get the information to the subject of the search right away, because we certainly could have waited to tell you, and Carol could have stayed in the play. Wanted to get it to you, ASAP. As soon as we were sure, we wanted to share that information with you. And Carol, I'm not sure I was even aware that you were dealing with that, because we could have put it off 5 more minutes at least. But
After 2 years, we'll give you 5 minutes.
I think my family was invested in it too, and
Sounds
my
like
kid knew this was a big deal. So
It speaks to the dedication that when people do this job, it's all encompassing. It's all engrossing. You can't look away from it until you solve it. And then even when you solve it, there's more usually to go looking for. So sounds like you had supportive family behind you, Carol. That's a good thing.
totally necessary.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was a wild ride. I remember getting texts and phone calls and just little emails every now and then. We found this that didn't work out, and that went on for 2 years, and we never lost. None of us ever said we're not going to solve this. I'm done. I'm going to quit. We dug in every day, and every day you hoped for something. And that's how I am today. Every day I'm still working on this. And, every day you hope for that one piece of information that's coming in, and that it's going to break it wide open. And then you're going to find the next thing you have to work on, because there's always a next thing.
And the truth ended up sort of opening up some of the family members. Then suddenly the stories started to come out, so that was interesting. Once, this became, known that Paul was one of the twins, suddenly I guess it was Leonard's first cousin started saying, okay, well, yes, I do remember this. And then you had an aunt on Marie's side who said, I think I have a picture of Marie when she was pregnant. And I said, please send it to us right now. Then the stories started to really, come out and become out in the open. I know they're not all there, but we did find out a lot of stuff, and thank goodness all those folks on that generation were still alive to be able to share some of those stories, because most of them are gone now.
I got to go to New Jersey, and I got to meet Lenny and his family, and Amy and her family, and everyone, and they were so welcoming. Typical Jersey fashion, right? They had rented out the whole basement portion of an Italian restaurant. We walked in. Hey, how you doing? Come on in. It was just a great family. And I don't know if you know this, CeCe, but just last year, I came across the whole clan in Tennessee, the Sullivans. There's like 100 of them. They all look like me, silver hair, good-looking people, and just the nicest people. I
thought you got your good looks from your Jewish side.
Yeah, I don't know. But I got to spend a weekend with them out there in Tennessee. Just amazing, wonderful people. So I guess Marie's dad left. He was like the oddball. He left that clan who are still in Tennessee. Very tight family, just open arms, whatever you need. He left and went to Ohio. And that's where all the bad started coming from. It's crazy, huh?
That is. So did you go to some sort of reunion, or how did you connect with them?
I connected to, they reached out to me. They, I think they saw one of the shows or something, and they reached out. And of course they started matching DNA with me on Ancestry and on 23andMe. So we started talking, and I realized that Marie was the common denominator. So I went out there, and in like a week's notice, they set up a whole family reunion out. They have like a huge property. It's a bunch of houses on this big property. And they said, yeah, come on down. So I went down there, and I spent a weekend there. They let me stay in their cabin. I'd never met these people before. They were just the nicest people. So I'm giving a shout out to the Sullivans. I can't wait to see you guys again, because you're awesome.
That's amazing. I'm so glad. We see that in almost all searches, I would say all. Somebody is welcoming to that new family member. It might not always be the birth parents. It might not always be the siblings. But we always see somebody in the birth family who's really excited to have that new family member. And so that's really heartwarming.
Just
to hear
amazing
that they
people.
welcomed you.
And the whole thing that started this was I wanted to be authentic to my daughter, Emma. And I wanted to know for sure if I was really Paul for medical reasons. So I find out I'm not Paul. I find out I'm Jack. And then I found out my mom and dad both died at 61. And then my older sister died at 57 or 52 or something, 47, super young. Right? So now it's like, I'm glad I did it, but now I'm glad that I'm still here, because I've got a long way to go. It opens your eyes up to what life's really all about when you find the truth.
Yeah, we hear that all the time from people in similar situations. It really does seem to answer some deep-seated identity questions for people, even ones who take a test and are shocked to find out they were adopted or have a different father and they weren't aware of it. We hear that same theme of, well, this explains a lot of things. This finally answers questions that I had, even if I wasn't asking them, publicly or consciously, they were there.
I was going to say that I've worked hundreds of adoptee and foundling and other cases in the last 10 years, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, I really wish I had never tested. It's always, that they're happy to have the truth, even if the truth is painful, even if, they weren't welcomed with open arms. They're happy to know the truth, and they don't regret going down that path.
I've heard the same, and I always think, am I just lucky? Because other people say they have these horror stories, but we just haven't had those negative outcomes in ours. And of course, there's disappointment, just like you had a lot of disappointment, of course, with your closest family members rejecting you. But there's always this positive in that knowing and that truth, and knowledge is power. That's kind of been my theme since I started working with genetic genealogy. I truly believe that, and it is really has been proven to be true for at least the vast majority of people who have gone down these types of roads.
And I agree that time is another factor that's important with some of these adoption cases or, foundlings. Even if they don't have that immediate connection with families, sometimes it's a year later. I remember a case where someone was looking for a birth father, and he initially just, flat out denied it and didn't want to be involved. And a year later, she got a phone call and said, he said, "I'd like to meet you." So it sometimes just takes a little bit of, the cushion of time for.
Yeah, and family situations change too. We've seen birth mothers who didn't want to connect, and then their spouse dies or they get a divorce, and suddenly they want to. It's just they didn't want to have to explain that to their partner or reveal that. And so we do always tell people to be patient. As hard as it is, don't give up. We've seen a lot of the cases Carol describes where someone has come around in a year or two, sometimes 5 years even.
I've told people the same thing, that, you've had time to think about this and to be in a certain space with what the information you've discovered. Now you're giving this information to someone who's had no time with it. And so they might need some time to digest it, really think about it, and then decide what they want to do with it.
That's
And
exactly
as far as
right.
the truth,
Yeah.
it's the not knowing that kills people.
Good advice.
Because if you don't know something, but you know something's not right, you can make up all kinds of things in your mind. You can ruminate on things that never happened. But once you know the truth, whether it's good or bad, it's the truth. You know it's real. You can process it and you can work through it because there's no other scenarios that you can make up in your mind.
I agree. And I would also add that I think keeping secrets isn't healthy. How many times have we, discovered the truth in a family of a foundling and realized like these folks died so young? I really feel like these secrets, holding these secrets inside and not, being open and honest, really shortened a lot of people's lives. And
I believe that for sure. All right. So a quick question for both of you. Since you guys work with DNA, different people, do you believe in nature or nurture?
Well, they're both important, of course, and you're a really good example of that, right? You can probably answer the question better than we can just from personal experience. But I will say that once I started working with genetic genealogy, I absolutely came to believe much more strongly in nature, and that we inherit so much more than people realize, because we've just seen so many crazy stories with people meeting their biological families, and there were just the strangest coincidences, like mother and daughter who showed up, in the same car with the same makeup in their makeup bag, who named their kids the same things, women, sisters that married men with the same name. I mean, things that you just can't even fathom how that could be passed down. But we've seen it so many times anecdotally that it's gotten to the point that it's impossible to deny it. They can't all be coincidences. Some of them could be. I mean, there was these siblings who met each other and they both had fake deers in their lawn and they lived in the city. It's just insane. And so, yeah, I do feel that we inherit much, much more from our ancestors than we've ever realized and may ever know. But of course, nurture is incredibly important too. And we see that, again, in our law enforcement work. We often see inherited dysfunction coming way back in the family, coming down those family lines. If I see great grandpa was a drunk and abusive, often I'll follow that line down first, right? Because that is also, being passed down in families. And so it really is a balance of both. But I think that most people underestimate the power of inheritance and what we're getting from our DNA.
I absolutely agree. I think, DNA is controlling so much more than we give it credit for, or that we've been able to prove scientifically. I think it is controlling a lot of our desires, our choices in life, things that we're attracted to, things we're repelled, from. And, it's what ends up leading people into the same career who didn't, grow up together.
Yeah, we saw that in LL Cool J's family too. When we found his biological grandmother, his mom and his grandmother had both worked at the same VA in New York as nurses. They didn't know each other, but it's just crazy when you see these similarities, and we've seen it thousands of times now. And so there just isn't any other explanation when someone is raised separate from their biological family, yet they make the same or very similar choices.
Yeah, it's really crazy, man. All right, so I want to ask you, what is the best memory you have working on this case?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, I think that when Carol called us and told us about the twins, and then building that tree back and hitting Tennessee and connecting with those other parts of your family that we knew existed, was when I was in tears. Like, that's when I was really moved to tears. But there's so many. I mean, seeing the article, meeting you in person when you came out to meet us all in Carlsbad was
I got the picture right there.
high point as well.
Around the fire pit?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yes. I got to give you the photo of your mom.
That was
who
so much
pregnant
fun.
with you.
Yes, the photographic evidence of
Of your
Jack's
existence.
existence. Carol, what big moment or big moments?
I mean, definitely the moment where all of the pieces of the puzzle come together. That's just, that high that you're craving on these sorts of journeys. It's just the biggest adrenaline rush, you could ever imagine. And it just makes sense, and everything, the matches are all lining up, and this goes to here, and, yeah, that's just pure elation. But I would also say, just the bond between our group. I mean, we worked really well together. We all had very complementary skills. We knew we could do this. We were confident of, the fact that we could resolve this. And so that triumph in the end was, thrilling too, knowing that, we've been able to get this across the finish line.
You're right. It was so nice shared, because it's so rare that happens in my work, at least, and I think yours too. When you have that moment, it's alone, and oftentimes there's no one to call. So
Right.
it's really nice to do it as a team. I agree with you, Carol. That's definitely a high point.
So CeCe, what's next for you? What are you working on? What would you like to promote? Anything?
Thank you so much. I was just saying, I was thinking to myself, oh, there is something I need to promote, which is DNA Justice, which is a nonprofit database for investigative genetic genealogy. So it's law enforcement access only, but we really need a database that is not for profit, because the two databases law enforcement has access to keep raising their prices for law enforcement uploads. So it costs $1,000 and $1,400 now to upload one case for law enforcement, and it's making it very difficult for them to afford this. It's already hard because law enforcement's already underfunded, especially for cold cases. And so we want to try to build this database, but it's not going to be viable until we get a lot of people supporting it. And just to clarify, I want to make sure people know that there is no option on Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage to help with law enforcement. So if you've only tested at one of those databases, you have to download your raw data, which I'm sure you guys are going to explain, and upload it to GEDmatch Family Tree DNA and or DNA Justice. And then on Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, you have to be opted into law enforcement matching. And so there's quite a few steps, and that's where we lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
They want to support us, but it can be confusing. The companies make you jump through a lot of hoops to get that raw data, and you've got to be able to understand how to do that if you want to help us.
Good stuff.
Carol has a very new accomplishment. I'll let her talk about.
Let's hear it, Carol.
Well, so CeCe and I were founding board members of a group called the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board. And we've been working for the last 3 years to put together standards for the industry. This has really been something that's, been needed and been called for even before investigative genetic genealogy became a thing, but it became even more important once, law enforcement cases were being worked. So we've developed some standards, but more importantly, we've pulled together a competency exam so that investigative genetic genealogists, who would like to become accredited now have the ability to do that. So there is a test, an exam that you can take, and then you are pledging to follow the standards and the ethics that were put into place by the board. And we launched that successfully in April. So, the exam's been out there, and I would encourage, if there are investigative genetic genealogists who are listening, to consider taking that exam. It's, a great, credential to have, to be able to say that you are competent, because it's hard for law enforcement to know. There's a lot of people knocking on their doors and saying, hey, I solved, these 2 adoption cases. And they think, well, great, you must be really, really good at what you do. But it takes a lot more than that. It takes a number of years of, doing this sort of work, and the experience that comes with working lots of cases with lots of different population groups and things of that sort. So I would also encourage law enforcement who might be listening as well to make sure that they are seeking out people who have passed this accreditation exam, because then you do know that you're getting someone who is, very experienced and much, more competent than the average person on the street. So that's what I would love to promote.
Well, this has been fantastic. I can't thank you enough for what you did and what you still do, and the fact that you guys have been stuck with me for all those years. I know I was kind of a pain. I was a pain in the ass sometimes. I know. I'm like, come on, you got to have something, CeCe's like,
So do you prefer to go by Jack or Paul now?
I like Jack. I like Jack.
Are people actually calling you that?
Yes, they are.
Okay, good. So I can call you Jack.
I am so relieved this episode is done, because I only know him as Jack. So the previous episodes we've done, it's like cut, because I'll call him Jack. I got to go back and call him Paul.
And when she calls me Paul, she always has a funny face. It's like, Paul?
Yeah. What? Who? Paul?
It doesn't quite feel right.
It doesn't. Yeah. Absolutely not.
So Tracy, how do you feel about this episode?
Well, I thought this was an incredibly fun episode. I looked forward to meeting both of these women for a long time, since reading your books and watching your documentary. And they're just as great as I thought they would be. Brilliant and creative and funny and great camera presence. It was a great time.
Yeah, it was a great journey.
Loved it.
You don't want to miss next week's episode. Tune in.
You really don't. Nope. Tune in.
Come back to the Fronczak Files.
The Fronczak Files is created and hosted by Paul Jack Fronczak. Co-hosted by me, Tracy Hastings. Edited by Gavin Bogner. Lead genetic genealogist, Emily Ripper. Lead historical researcher, Colleen Newhart. Social media manager, Amy Morris. Original theme music written and produced by Paul Jack Fronczak and Rick Howland. Thank you for joining us on the journey, and please remember to subscribe.